Hey everyone, I would like to quickly talk about Azure Active Directory Workload Identity and how you can use it in your app to authenticate with any kind of Azure service. So think about you have an application requiring Azure SQL, storage account, Redis, or any other Azure service, and you could just rely on the connection string to authenticate with them. But this isn't the best idea. Because the connection string contains long-living secrets, and basically if you rely on it, you have to think about secret rotation on your own. You also need to think about how to inject the connection string into the runtime. So many things to care about, and there are better options. So first of all, we have managed identity. This isn't pretty new, so maybe you're just already using it or at least heard about it. So basically managed identity are service principals living in your Azure Active Directory. These are some kind managed through Azure automatically. They rely on certificate-based authentication and have an expiration date of 90 days and do an automatic rollover every 45 days. So pretty neat so far. And you can use managed identity basically to talk any Azure resource which supports Azure Active Directory authentication. The only downside is that you need to be an Azure resource talking to these services. But something later on that one. There are two options here. So you have system-assigned identities. These are basically really tied to the corresponding Azure resource and share the same lifecycle. On the other hand, you have user-assigned identities, which you can create. So they're basically Azure resources you can manage, and you can then assign them to multiple resources, and basically you are managing them further. There's something else. So if you're in a federated scenario, you can rely on Azure Active Directory Workload Identity Federation. What is this? Basically, you can use Azure Workload Identity Federation to authenticate with any Azure Active Directory protected resources from outside Azure. So managed identity relies on an Azure resource talking to an Azure resource. Here with Workload Identity Federation, basically it can be any resource. So think about in a CI/CD use case, for example with GitHub Actions or with GitLab, you can just rely on them to authenticate with Azure to deploy something. On the other hand, think about workload running Kubernetes cluster. They would like to talk with any kind of Azure resources, also possible. And it doesn't matter to be AKS, so Azure Kubernetes Service can be any Kubernetes server. Basically, it can be anything supporting OpenID Connect, so nearly all other cloud providers and even on premises. So how does this work? So basically, your external workload, your application is basically talking to your identity provider and requesting a token. Then your identity provider validates that and will send you a token back. And with this token, you can basically, or your application can then go to the Azure Active Directory, to the underlying managed identity or service principal, and Azure Active Directory will then validate this token, validate if there's a trust with your OpenID identity provider, and if everything is fine, you will basically can use this token to talk to the Azure Directory protected resources on Azure. So basically everything relies on OpenID Connect, short-living secrets, and you don't need to care about much. You can also rely on Azure Active Directory Workload Identity with AKS. And this allows you to basically integrate your AKS with, for example, Azure Active Directory. This completely relies on Kubernetes upstream features. So first of all, we have service account token volume protection, which basically injects into your running pod token, which then can use to talk to the Kubernetes API. And on the other hand, the Kubernetes API is federated with the Azure Active Directory. Basically, the things which will happen is basically the same. So the kubelet will talk to the Kubernetes API server. Then the Kubernetes API server will talk to the Azure Active Directory. Once again, Azure Active Directory will then validate the request against OpenID. And everything is fine. It returns the final token, and then your workload and kubelet can go to the Azure resources, which is authenticated with Active Directory, and then basically can talk to them, retrieve database stuff, and so on. So pretty nice. So how does this work? Basically, you can rely on the Azure SDK default credentials. So there is a library called Azure Identity within the Azure SDK, and there can use either default Azure credentials or the workload identity credentials, both doing basically the same stuff. I would recommend to rely on the default Azure credentials because they're basically supporting different kinds of credentials, which then helps you in an inner loop when you're developing on your local machine. and basically do not have workload identity available because you're not running on Azure, then you have a fallback to environment variables, which is Studio secrets, Visual Studio Code secrets, or Azure CLI secrets, which is pretty neat. So just rely on the Azure SDK using the default Azure credentials and you're just fine. Yeah, to sum up, a big picture. On the left side, you're seeing service account with the annotation to use workload identity and which managed identity or client ID to use. On the left upper side, we have a pod definition here and a label to tell the pod to use workload identity. And on the right, we have a small Go application which uses the default credentials to just retrieve a key vault and a secret from the key vault. So it's pretty easy. So just sum up with that one. Hope you learned something new, and yeah, and have fun securing your applications. Bye.